Okay, today we're going to go over something. We have a news guy who has done something in reference to reparations. Seems this video's gone viral. I've heard about it. I watched it. You can watch the full video. We're just going to play a quick clip from that video and take a look at what this guy has to say real quick.
Etc. But reparations is a specific conversation about a specific time in America, and that is black people were slaves. You know what I mean? I've even heard people say like, oh, but there were some of the Irish who were indentured. Like, yeah, slavery. Look at the numbers, look at the time, look at the level of work. You could not work toward your freedom. For most black people in America, this was a time when you lived and died as a slave. And so that's what reparations is about. And so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a completely separate conversation that needs to be had about the now. Because if you are not careful, what you then do is you combine everybody's suffering into the same bowl, and you make it seem like all injustices have the same weighting, and they don't. Just like crimes, you know.
Okay, well, what he's saying is that black people, he's making it appear as though black people are the only people who are suffering from slavery. This is what he says. And, you know, what we have to, in my opinion, what we have to do is we have to start, where does slavery start in order to get to it? And I'm going to try and do this all as brief as I possibly can, because he's not right. He's totally off base, obviously doesn't know. He's probably got a paper brain from one of these colleges today that just teach a certain set of, you know, what they want people to believe. But let us take a look and a quick listen here, because this is a book that was written by an African who did some in-depth study on the African history and where African black slavery actually starts. Let's just take a quick listen to this, and then we'll go on.
The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa by John Alambila Azuma. My whole perspective and understanding has changed dramatically, and I would like you to tell us more about this subject.
The success of Muhammadan Islam in deceiving, misinforming, deforming, and contorting both history and reality over a period of almost 1400 years has been astounding. That is, until now. The greatest tragedy about this particular subject is that most of the descendants of African slavery, the black people in the Americas, around the world, as well as among the African blacks, are totally ignorant of the actual facts. Before we lose the concentration of our listeners, I would like to make the following statement and then prove it. That the worst, most inhumane and most diabolical institution of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined, perpetrated, and implemented by the Mohammedan Arabs, and later aided and abetted by the black converts to Mohammedan Islam. I predict that, as usual, the two subcultures, those of denial of facts and of political correctness, will attack us without once disproving a single statement and or conclusion that we make.
Okay, so what we have here is a guy in Africa who's done an in-depth study. Now, I myself have been studying world culture and world history for 40 years. I agree with this man, because when I look at it, I realize slavery is something that's been around for a long time. Over, you know, throughout the 10,000 year history we know in written records, we can find slavery goes back as far as 10,000 years. We see the first colonization of slavery by an elite ruler in Egypt, where the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians. This trend with them had continued on. As far as what he's talking about in relation to slavery, Islam founded slavery after it was founded, and they invaded North Africa in 640 AD. And after invading North Africa and conquering it, they enslaved the majority of Africa and started the black slave trade back then. At this time and following this time, Britain, as well as the rest of the world, and China, all different countries, became reliant upon the Islamic states for their slave trade. And they had an ample supply of black African slaves that they would provide to everybody who needed slave labor. Muhammad, the founder of Islam himself, didn't have much favor for black people whatsoever. He claims in the Quran that the angel Gabriel came to him, told him to warn all Muslims to know that should they come across a black man, they should know his heart is more grosser than a donkey. He also set the value system to why black Africans became the most prominent and popular of slaves, because in his value system, he had claimed that a white person was worth twice as much as a black person. And this is well followed through with the slave trade. Most people looking to get slave labor, if they wanted to buy slaves, if they were looking to get a white slave, for the same cost they could buy a white slave, they could get 2 black slaves. So this was one of the reasons why black slavery became a very popular thing with the slave trade. We can see that with Britain, as you can see here in this thing here, is about with Britain, how they had became very profitable in dealing in slaves as well. The British, as well as some of the French, were dealing very large with slavery, and this is back, like I say, near 1,200 years before America was even founded. This is all going on 1,200 years before America is even founded. The black African slave is being slaved out all around the world, to China, all around. They had West Coast, East Coast. They were being bought and sold all around the world 1,200 years before America was even founded. We did not find, we were not the founders of the black slave trade. I'm just saying. So now, when it gets up, we're just going to bump ahead a little bit here. You got the British now going along with slavery. Very, very involved they were. You have the point here, like with the Virginia, which I'm going to show you now. When the new colonies here, we're going to jump ahead now, because mind you, 1,200 years now, black Africans have been slaves and being slaved through Britain. With the Islamic states, the Muslims are the biggest dealer in slaves at this time, all the way up to this point of where America is discovered. When America is founded now, we're under British rule. The original settlers in the colonies did not want slavery. They were fleeing oppression from totalitarian regimes like Britain. The whole majority of all the world around the colonies was all democracies. Superior rulers, kings, emperors, demigods, totalitarian regimes like Islam. And the new colonies was trying to break away from all that. But as you can see here, when you look at this here, you can see up at the top it says from 1607 to 1776. This was how long British had rule over us. And during that time, what was going on was the British were actually purchasing the African slaves from the Islamic State, reselling them here in the new colonies of the Americas. And not only were they selling them, they were importing them into what they appointed as their governors and their elitists, who they appointed among the new colonies to generate revenue and money for them, and also to farm the land and produce produce for them that they could export it out to other countries and make more money. It was all about wealth with the British. And America became a new continent that they could capitalize on for that wealth. The majority of governors and such that were placed in the United States, before it was the United States, back then we were under the Confederacy, like a federation with Britain. It's like a friendship agreement where they were letting us do our own thing, but still under British rule. Virginia had become a predominant place for slavery, where slaves were being brought in. Now, he speaks about this as like, he says that he believes that, slaves could not, buy their freedom or what have you, but that's not true either. A large amount of slaves that were coming in, who came willingly wanting to come here, came as indentured servants, just like many white people. This here in this picture is a picture of a man who was a slave of another man named Anthony Johnson. And this goes back to a time with him, back to a period in the mid 1600s, early 1600s. And Anthony Johnson had 3 slaves who had taken off, ran away from him, and he had wanted them back, but they were claiming that they had a right, that they finished their indentured servant and they should be freed. Well, the courts in this case agreed with Anthony Johnson that he had a right to retain his indentured servants, and Anthony Johnson raised claim about the one African who he had, that he had a right to own that African for all of that African's natural life as chattel property. And the courts agreed with him again. The other two, and this is funny because the other 2 men were indentured servants. They were ordered by the court to serve 3 more years to Anthony Johnson, but the African's indentured servant was now considered chattel, a slave, and Anthony Johnson was awarded to own him to the day he dies for all of his natural life. Now, Anthony Johnson, here's the ironic part. Anthony Johnson was a black man. He was a man who came to Virginia, worked for a tobacco farmer, obtained his own freedom, bought land, owned plantations, and he owned upwards of hundreds of black slaves. He was even, records show that he was even a slave breeder. He breeded slaves and he sold slaves out to other colonists who were in favor for slavery. But and most of those colonists consisted of the loyal to Britain. They were the British subjects who were here in this country, and the farmers who were the governors of the states who were generating the revenue for Britain at the time. So, like I say, you know, what he says is not so much true. Not only do we see with here you have the British Royal African Company that supplied slaves to Jamestown. It became a very big business that the Britain were making a lot of money on. The Islamic states were making a lot of money on because they were the primary dealers in slaves. The original settlers in the American colonies since the founding of this country were opposed to slavery. They didn't want slavery here. They were running from this because, you know, it wasn't only just blacks that were slaves. This guy totally obviously has his own depiction of reality to what history was, but in truth, the Islamic states didn't only enslave black slaves, they also enslaved white slaves. Anyone who was not a Muslim was subject to being slaves. And then this as well, you know, and this is something you got to realize. When you look at the truth of history over the prior 1,400 or 1,200 years before America was founded, the real truth comes out to that more than likely the numbers were very similar to how many black Africans were enslaved to how many whites were enslaved by the Islamic states. They would invade lands and capture white slaves and sell them as sex slaves and use them as labor slaves and use them mostly as soldiers. That was the main thing, including with the black Africans. They had the black Africans as slaves. They made them fight their wars for them in their pursuit to try and take world dominance and rule the world. This was the goal of the Islamic states. This is what they wanted to do. Britain was involved in a lot of this as well. They did a lot of importing and exporting and resale on slaves for centuries before America was even founded. And these are the things we have to consider as well. White slaves. He makes mockery about the Irish slave. Thousands and thousands of Irish slaves were brought here to America as indentured servants. Many of them wound up slaves. Many of them from Ireland direct on invasions from the Islamic states wound up slaves. There was many white Christian slaves in the world. Black people were not the only people who were slaves. This misconception of truth is astonishing. But, you know, facts are facts, and obviously nobody's learning the facts. They're just, you know, going with the subject to whatever fits their agenda. But like I say, you know, there was many white slaves as well. Not only was there white slaves, but as well during the time of following with Anthony Johnson and along the time even right up to even after the Revolutionary War, today we hear a lot of people, they speak about, you know, that not only were the black people oppressed, but the poor Indians, you know, the poor Indians had a hard time too. Well, I want to play a quick clip here, just a small section so you can understand. This man here, he had done some research, and he's a guy who's looked into this. His family's tied to this research, so it's an important history to him. But we're just going to play a quick clip so you understand how widespread slavery was, and you know he's focusing at just the white people. So let's just take a listen to this guy.
In our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information.
I'm just going to skip ahead some on this because a lot of it's, we don't want to eat up time.
We're at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, when both my great-grandmother Phyllis Pettit and her brother Johnson Thompson were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project. Now, both of them are buried in this cemetery. But after I read their words, I was set on a mission to find out how my family became slaves of the Indians. I learned that beginning with the administration of George Washington, it was the policy of the U.S. government to civilize the Indians by teaching them modern farming techniques.
To adopt agricultural practices that patterned after the whites, and one of those in the South was slave trade.
I don't ever talk about it very much because I think it's a very shameful part of Cherokee history, and so I've purposely avoided involving myself in that whole issue.
While the current chief may be ashamed, at the Cherokee Museum today are slave bills of sale, including one for 3 slaves bought in 1841 by then Principal Chief John Ross. The chief and his brother Lewis were among the biggest slaveholders in the tribe. Indeed, many of my mother, Kathleen's ancestors, the Rosses, were owned by the chief's family.
So, as you can see here, this is a part of American history that the American Indians don't care to talk about. Like this lady says here, they kind of avoid it, and they do. It's kind of like, as well with the Democrats, they try to avoid the truth of what's going on here. And like this guy who's doing this news broadcast, he's, I believe, very leaning left, and he supports that. But anyway, as we progress up to the point of the Revolutionary War, people got to understand, all the way up to that point, even with Thomas Jefferson, there was many debates about abolishing slavery in this country. No one of the original settlers of that of American ideology, or Americans in the original colonies, wanted slavery. They were not the ones expanding slavery. They were not the ones looking to import slaves. All the slaves coming in were being imported in by the British king to farm and labor his what can you call it, his appointed authorities that he placed here to look over it. So you had a bunch of British like British rulers that were here, governors. Most of them were appointed by him as governors and what have you. They were the wealthiest people. They were the British loyalists at the time when the Revolutionary War came about. They were known as the British Loyalists. These guys owned the majority of the plantations, and they owned the majority of all the slaves that were in the newfound land of America. And they were the ones benefited from them and the King of Britain. Now, upon us claiming our independence in 1776, when we filed that, most people aren't aware that, we know of the Civil War in the 1860s, but we don't recall that the Loyalists, there was like a civil war going on in this time as well. It appears that history today, they're not teaching anybody, I guess, the truth of history, because this is a fact. The Loyalists were loyal to the British king. They were also knowing that, the northern colonies of the original settlers and the Americans, they didn't want slavery. Now, these guys were very much wanting to keep their slaves because they were the wealthiest in the newfound land. They had these big, massive plantations. They had hundreds or thousands of slaves working for them. All they had to do was kind of sit back and let everybody work for them and make money. And being they were loyalists to the king, they got treated like, royalty. So they had it made. So actually, during the Revolutionary War, when we declared our independence, we had the Civil War going on with them because they were against us. And, these people, too, like I say, they had alliances as well with many black slave owners who owned large plantations, who breeded slaves for them and helped them, as well in exchange of slaves and what have you. Many black people owned slaves, plantations, used the slaves for slave labor, breeded slaves for selling them. It was not just white people. It was not really a white and black issue. This was just an economical thing in a time that was normalcy around the whole world. Prior to America, everywhere in the world was a democracy and ruled by a dictator, a totalitarian. And if you didn't have the power, the manpower or the weaponry to fight off the oppressors, you were going to be a slave. That's just the way it was. If you didn't have the ability to fight off the Muslims, they were going to enslave you. If you didn't have the ability to fight off the Britain, they were going to do what they wanted with you and whatever your land was. There was nothing you could really do about it. But following our claiming of Declaration of Independence, and like I say, this is one thing here, which I'm going to post links to all this stuff so everybody can go and afterward look below the video. You'll be able to see all the links to it. But this here talks about the omitted wording that was taken out of the Declaration of Independence. When the Declaration of Independence was made, we were going to charge Britain with what they did. And I'm just going to read this. Okay, it says here, he was waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred right of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery into another hemisphere to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This particular warfare of the I can't say Abrium of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for the suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restriction this exabrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want not fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Now understand, when you look at this, Thomas Jefferson in drafting this, what he said and what he meant, and for a long time the colonists didn't want slavery. During this time, what Britain had done and what the Loyalists had done was, because they had so many slaves, and just like what the Muslims did, they wanted to use these slaves for the war. So with the Loyalists attacking the Patriots, they figured they could use the slaves. So what Britain did and the Loyalists did was tell them, hey, we'll give you your freedom if you fight for us. So many of them joined in with the Loyalists to fight against the Patriots, many of the black slaves, believing they were going to get their freedom by doing this if they won the war, I guess. Because in the end result, it turns out that being they lost it, and there was like an estimated 80,000 Loyalists had fled the American continent and went back to either Britain or fled into Canada. Most of them who fled took their slaves. Some left their slaves behind on plantations. And they fled. They just fled the country because at that time the Patriots were capturing them. They were traitors. They were tar and feathering them, hanging them, and executing them because these people were traitors, the Loyalists. Well, upon the exit of when the war finally came to an end and America had won, okay, and we had claimed our independence, and it was clear, many more Loyalists kept fleeing the Americas, and they had promised these slaves that they would get their freedom if they fought. Well, many of them did, and some of them left with them, only to wind up going back to Britain and being sold back into slave markets into Britain and France. And some of them who the Loyalists didn't want to take and didn't even care to take, that they promised it to, there's stories that are in letters in the archives that are stories reported about them swimming out, trying to swim out to the boats to leave, to go have their freedom, and that the British Loyalists were literally swinging and chopping out their arms when they reached for the boat and letting them drown. Okay, so these guys, all the black Africans at the time who fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the Loyalists for Britain wound up back into slavery anyway. As time would progress, we made the biggest mistake in our history because, you know, we allowed these Loyalists who were in the South to kind of stay, and then after the Revolutionary War, some of them started coming back and they filed class action, like lawsuits with the courts. They wanted their land back, and they wanted, you know, the states here had started to declare their rights as states, that they wanted the right to keep their slaves, and they wanted slavery. They knew the colonists didn't want this, but they wanted it. And slave rights at the time, with the newly established of our country, there was not much we could do. I mean, we're in the process of just forming our nation and trying to find a footing. When we look here, though, this is something that it seems most are not aware of. You know, if you ask somebody when slavery was abolished in America, they think it started in the 1860s with the Civil War, the Second Civil War. But in truth, upon us filing our Declaration of Independence and starting the Revolutionary War, the colonists, the first state in the colonies to abolish slavery was Vermont in 1777. Vermont was followed as time progressed as well through the Revolutionary War and leading right up to the division in this country and in our government. As states followed suit with Vermont, like New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Washington, you know, the other states, Massachusetts, they all started to abolish slavery in the northern states, and they were known as the free states. As we progressed through time, getting up near the point where, you had these now, and mind you, in this transition that was taking place, like here, I've got these links here, show it's about the Loyalists. Okay, we drafted our Constitution. Following the Constitution, we drafted our Declaration of our Bill of Rights, and I think it was 1891 that by the time where it was all together, we had a Bill of Rights. No, it was not in 1891. It was a little bit earlier than that. Let's see if I got any notes on that. We'll see as we progress. But the U.S. Constitution was in 1787. It says it right here, 80, and then following that, I believe it was 1891 that we established. This Constitution was in 1787. We established in 1791 a Declaration of Rights, our Bill of Rights, if I'm not mistaken. That's how it went. So as we progress forward with the Bill of Rights and what have you, many felt that, here it is right here, 1791 is where that was. Okay, and now mind you, following all this here, we head into our first war as an independent nation. Mind you, up until this point too, being that we were like Vermont abolishing slavery and us not wanting slavery, we had a problem with the primary slave provider. Prior to the Revolutionary War, the Islamic states were not bothering the colonists much in their travels because Britain was paying what's called the jizya tax with the Muslims, and the Muslims were leaving us alone. Now that we are an independent nation, the Islamic State had charged us that we had to pay this jizya tax. They were extorting like they were the mafia. And we didn't want to pay that tax, but at first we had no choice because under Washington we didn't have a navy, we were very depleted from the Revolutionary War and ability to be able to fight them at that time. So there was a time we did pay the jizya. But as we progressed forward and we were growing as a nation and we were abolishing slavery, they became a little more agitated with us, started capturing our ships again in 1801 and enslaving our people. We were given an option to either pay the jizya tax, a ransom, or the people would be sold off into slavery. This was our first war. They call this like the Democrats do and like the British do and everybody. They mask things, try to hide who it was. They call it the Barbary Wars. Like we had two of them. One was in 1801, the other one was in 1815. But these were actually the Islamic State Muslim Wars, because they were the capital slave states and they believed that they have authority to rule the world, and any non-Muslim nation should have to pay them what's called the jizya tax. Okay, but as we progress on, again, moving forward in time, in America, we had enacted here the Act of Prohibition of Importing Slaves to America, as the northern colonies were, abolishing slavery. And we didn't want slavery, and this was growing around the new formed nation. We knew we had to stop the importation of slaves. This created, again, another issue with the Islamic states, because, and as well even with Britain at the time, because they were making huge profit in these slaves, selling them to the southern states, what had become the democratic states. This is another thing they call North and South, but in truth it was Southern Democrats versus Northern Free Republics. We had and then as time progressed through from the Revolutionary War up to what we're getting into near the Civil War, we had a divided nation, and where we had free states and we had slave states. The free states, and we had what was known as the Mason-Dixon line. In the free states, slavery was being abolished, and the Southern Democratic states, slavery was allowed, and they were fighting to have that right to keep slavery. So we prohibited the slave trade of any importing of slaves here, and then we wound up facing the Second Barbary War in 1815, where again they started attacking our ships, and we had to go to war with them again. And then as well, during this war, we also had a second Revolutionary War at that time with Britain. Democracies like to stay united, and the Democrats that were in the South, Britain, and as well, everywhere in the world is a democracy but America. We're a republic. And a lot of people seem to be forgetting that we're a republic, and we're the only really true free republic in this world at this time, and we are the only ever nation to be able to establish. We're 242 years new in this world. These nations have been doing this for centuries. Some of them thousands of years, thousands and thousands of years. Okay, we're 242 years new. And we can't forget this. We can't forget this. The United States of America had nothing to do with the slavery coming in. You had Dixiecrats up north that owned slaves. You had, most of them were the British loyalists who owned the slaves. And as you can see here, January 8th, with the rise of slavery being abolished in the northern states, the Southern Democrats and the Loyalists, who are now, they were the Loyalists, now they're the Democrats. They formed the Democratic Party, which was a party that was in favor of keeping state rights and keeping slavery allowed, and they wanted to expand slavery. But they knew the northern states were against this. They knew that, it was being abolished up north, and they kept fighting, wanting to have state rights. So that this is where the division starts between two government forms coming into the nation of America. In the north, you had the Republican Party, which formed, and we'll take a look and see. The Democrats formed in 1828. We had, like I say here, this is an example. You can go look. I'll put these links for what was the free states and what were the slave states at the time of when this took place. And then you had, at this time, we had the Republican Party, which was formed in 1854. The Republican Party was founded as an anti-slavery party. The goal was, as it was since the time of the Revolution, to abolish slavery. The Southern Democratic Party did not want to abolish slavery. They wanted to expand slavery. There's archive facts that are in there, which if I find links online to these things, I'm going to post the links all with this video. But that they already had agreements for wanting to purchase large shiploads of black African slaves from the Islamic states when they knew that we had a ban on any importation. But obviously the plans were already in the works. We were leading up to a civil war. We kind of knew this was going to happen. In the South, they had, when the Civil War finally did come about, which started in, I believe, South Carolina, the South succeeded and other states followed with them. The other slave states followed with them, succeeding from the Union of the United States. The United States wanted to abolish slavery. The South wanted to retain it and expand it. In the South, they had their first Democratic president who was elected was Davis Jefferson. He was the first Democratic president who was established. He was the one who coerced all the other southern slave states to come within the Confederacy they established, the Confederate slave states, and to secede from the Union. They had drafted their own constitution, which in the drafting of their constitution, they turned America from that of a republic form into that of a democracy, and they abolished in their constitution any right for anyone to make a law against slavery. They wanted to expand slavery. When you look and you read Jefferson's book, The Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, which he wrote when he spent 2 years in prison for treason, you can see pretty clear that their whole goal was the expansion of slavery, as well as you can see that the main issue of the Civil War was over slavery when you look at all the letters of succession. The first paragraph of most of those letters of succession, like from Texas, Georgia, and what have you, state their primary reason is that because the North is abolishing slavery and they want to maintain slavery and expand it. So, I mean, these things are a fact. This guy in this news thing, he wants to blame the Americans, and he's not being realistic about who was really responsible for slavery. Now, from the time of the Revolutionary War to the time of the Civil War is about 85 years. Some people say, oh, well, why did it take 85 years? Like I've said before to people, you got to understand the time. We're thinking modern time like today. But in the time of when this happened, let's say like with Abraham Lincoln, who was our first Republican president, with Abraham Lincoln, okay? Lincoln was the first Republican president who was elected as an anti-slavery president for the northern colonies who wanted to abolish slavery. If Lincoln wanted to try to negotiate with Jefferson Davis and get him a letter from Washington, well, in that time, that letter had to be sent on horseback. Okay, and it could take 8, 12, 16 months depending on what time of the year they sent them. If it was winter, big blizzards, what have you, it could take 18 months to get the letter down to him, and then another 8, 12, or 14 months to get a response back from him. So one comment back and forth in that time could take a year and a half, 18 months to sometimes 3 years, depending on what the seasons were like in the winter and if it was bad for travel on horse, because that's all they had. They didn't have phones, they didn't have internet, they didn't have airplanes, they didn't have motor vehicles, they had horses, and that's how you communicated back then, on a horse. Okay, so if Lincoln wanted to get a message to Jefferson Davis, he handed it in a letter to a guy. Guy rode a horse all the way down to Georgia and gave it to him. So understand, that's why it took as long as it did. And then even in the progression of it, like I say, the northern states were abolishing slavery. They were not in favor of it. They didn't want it, because we as well knew the reason we came to these colonies was to get away from the totalitarian rule of this sick world that likes to enslave people. Okay, and like I say, this guy makes it out like it was just blacks, and he puts, slaves. Well, let me tell you, an equal number of white people in the 1,200 years of the Islamic State were as well captive and held as slaves as what was probably done in the transatlantic slave trade. That's a fact. And another fact is, right now in this very day, the Islamic States, allied to today's Democratic Party, still has legal under the Sharia law in their state slave trade. And they're still dealing in African black slaves, and they're still dealing in white Christian slaves in this very day right now as I'm speaking. So, you're raising issues that you want reparations. Well, if you want reparations, I think you need to take reparations up with the people who are truly responsible. You can take your reparations to that of the Confederate Democratic slave states and that of the Islamic totalitarian slave states, okay? Because the United States had nothing to do with it. The United States is the cause of it ending, okay? You raise these issues, but you don't take into account the thousands and thousands of white American men who gave their life in the Civil War fighting to free all those black slaves. Okay, you make this out like it's white people's fault. Well, it was white people who fought the Civil War to free these people. In the northern colonies, there was many free black Americans that were able to own businesses, buy property, do business, work jobs, and be free. Okay, that was the goal of the true American. Okay, and you're making this out like America's not responsible. No Republicans ever owned a slave. For the time of the founding with the American Republican Party, no Republicans ever owned a slave. Okay, the true Americans didn't. The people who owned the slaves were the loyalists who became the Democrats of Britain and the Islamic State Muslims. Okay, and then too, another fallacy that's given to the American black people is that when they were brought here, they're told that their foreign ideology was Islam. That again is another lie. A fact of truth is that the Islamic States invaded North Africa in 640 AD. They enslaved the African people then. They started raiding into the South Africans at the time. And in that time, the South Africans and the majority of Africa was either that of their tribal ideology, or they were practicing Judaism or Christianity. Okay, but they were not Muslims. And it is against Sharia law to sell a Muslim as a slave. So all the slaves that they were selling to Britain, and as well to eventually the Southern Democrats, were not Muslims, because it's forbidden in the Quran and as well under Sharia law, and they're very disciplined to this, that even if it's a black person, they can't sell them as a slave. So all those people were innocent village, like tribal people, and they had nothing to do. They were just captured up and for revenue and profits by the Muslims, shipped off and sold to the British. The British shipped them here, or they were directly shipped here from purchases made directly with them. Many of the African kings as well. The only ones that were converted to Islam were the African kings. The rulers of the tribes and the chiefs, they would be made Muslim, because that way the Islamic States could control them, and they would be willing in exchange for what they call like magic and trinkets and whatever, and the privilege of being a Muslim. They would give up their village people, and they would send their own people on raids to collect slaves for them to export out to Britain or the Americas for the people who wanted slavery. So, I mean, these are things of fact and truth. Take some time, people, and look into it, because, I mean, we have to get real about what was going on here. Like I was mentioning earlier, too, right here we have a thing about where, like during the time with the Civil War, this is an article that was done in relation to when the Civil War was breaking out. You had the Loyalists, and then they had, like I said, there was many black slave owners who owned slaves, and during the Civil War, the Southern Democrats had told their slaves again You know, if like the British did to them in the Revolutionary War, they lied to them and told them we're going to give you your freedom. Okay, but they tried this again, you know, and then two, this time they really didn't have to. There were so many blacks that owned slaves and big plantations. They willingly went and agreed to fight with the Confederacy because they wanted to preserve slavery because they owned mass slaves. They owned big plantations. They didn't want to lose their labor force either, and they were black people. They were black people who owned big tobacco farms, big cotton fields. They worked just like the slave masters of the white or the black. It didn't matter. And they fought with the Confederate to against the Patriots, trying to, you know, keep slavery alive because they wanted to keep their slaves, and these were black slave owners. Some of them, like I said, they were in big business with breeding slaves, selling slaves themselves, and use of slaves on their own plantations. This is a part of history nobody wants to talk about, but it's a fact of history that, in light of what is now coming about today, needs to really be reviewed and the truth to understand. Again, this was not so much about a black or white issue. It was about if you didn't have the ability to fight off the oppressor, you were going to be a slave no matter what your color was. Okay? And when you look at the truth of slavery in the last, 2,000 years, just as many white people were being enslaved as black people. This is a fact when you look at the facts of history and you do the research on it. It's self-evident. It's unquestionable. As we progressed ahead, like I say, coming in after we won the Civil War, okay, the Free Republic now of America beat the Southern Democrats. The Republicans won that war, and we wanted to have change. We drafted a new constitution, and we got rid of the Confederacy that we had with Britain. And we under this constitution, we eventually added amendments during the time of the Civil War. These amendments would be the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, of which would, 1, abolish slavery, 2, would allow equal protection of the law, freedom, and liberty to the black Americans, and the 15th Amendment would give them the right to vote. All of these amendments, the biggest mistake we made after the Civil War was letting the Democrats back into our political party, to be a political party, and into our government, and even allowing them to vote. This was a big mistake we made, because by the time these amendments were coming to floor, and, we did this, what they said, because really in truth what happened was Abraham Lincoln got killed. Okay, we all know Abraham Lincoln got assassinated. And when Lincoln got assassinated, they appointed his vice president, and what this article here goes into, he was called King Andy, and that was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. Lincoln took him as a vice president, hoping that he could favor some of the Southern Democrats who probably really weren't, like today's a lot of Democrats. They're not really racist. They don't even know the history of their own party. They're just dud. They don't even know the truth of it. They don't take the time to actually find out anything I'm telling you. And, Abraham Lincoln, when he took Andrew Jackson as vice president, he did so hoping that Andrew Jackson would be able to maybe gain some favor with the Southern Democrats who opposed slavery. Because not everybody in the South was in favor of it. It was mostly those who were of the loyalist party to the British, who were, in favor of a democracy. Like in the Civil War, they actually tried to overthrow the country and form a democracy, redraft their own constitution and make their own laws. And they wanted to, everything was in favor of expanding slavery. Mass expansion is what they wanted. And like I say, in their constitution of the Democratic Confederate Slave States, they made it mandatory that no one could abolish slavery. That was one of their primary goals in their constitution they drafted in the South. So if they had won that war, right now black people would definitely be slaves, because they distinguished that no African could be free. That's what the Democratic Party wanted in the Democratic Confederate Slave States. They had mandated that no black African could be a free man in this country. That would have been the way it turned out had they won the war. This is something people got to understand. Now, Andrew Jackson is another interesting story, because you had Jefferson Davis, who was the first Democratic president to the Confederate slave states. Abraham Lincoln selected this guy as his vice president. More than likely, this is what the South had in plan, that they would be able to probably retake power by killing Lincoln and having Andrew Jackson appointed as the president. Which, with him, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was opposed or presented, the Democrats all opposed it. They didn't want it. And what Andrew Jackson did was he pardoned all these treasonous pricks of the Democrats who committed treason on us, and allowed again for the Democratic Party to have a voting right and to come back into our government. Well, eventually in time, which I'll post a link to this, you can read up about, King Andy, if you don't already know about King Andy. I would think hopefully school teaches, obviously today they don't, because like I say, a couple of years ago I seen something where they had a 2-year law student who was a black American girl, and the guy asked her when the Civil War was. She said it was in 1965. When he asked her if Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat or Republican, she said that Lincoln was a Democrat. I couldn't believe this. A second-year law student down in a Georgia law school that he was questioning. I mean, just so I get a lot of. So just follow the links. Get yourself educated, because these are all facts. Okay, King Andy is a very important story about him. He wound up, Andrew Jackson got impeached. We threw him out of the government because we realized what he was trying to do. He was trying to reinstill the democracy that they first pursued, even though they lost the war. Now we had a Democratic vice president who became president. So he was removed. And that was what happened with the first Democratic president after the first with Jefferson Davis. He got impeached. Okay, and ever since this time, the Democrats have been pursuing what they wanted. After the Civil War, as we can see, we progressed into, the Democrats went ahead and they formed the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of today people try to say that's not true, but the truth of the matter is the Ku Klux Klan was founded by 6 former Civil War Confederacy Democrats. Okay, and what they were there to do was, being that they couldn't stop the Northern government Republican from enacting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they formed the Ku Klux Klan to try and suppress black people for being able to exercise their rights. And they were pretty successful. They started in 1865, just following the Civil War, using these kind of tactics. These kind of tactics eventually led into another Democrat who formed the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws, again, were another obstructionist kind of law that tried to prohibit blacks. They would, combined with these laws in the Ku Klux Klan, it was segregation going on. They tried to, just keep a division going. I'm sure most black Americans should be aware of the Jim Crow laws, and I mean, you should be aware too, if you're a Democrat, that was your party who established these things. Okay, I don't understand to this day why any black American would be a Democrat. All the way up until the 1950s and 60s, the majority of blacks knew to be Republicans, because that was the anti-slavery party, and they were the true colonist Americans who did not want slavery in this country, who established, like I say, starting in 1777 with Vermont, the first free states in this country where slavery was abolished. The switch that took place, as we all know, they claimed that, we had LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, and he was the supposedly the guy who, came about and, became the civil rights guy, they say, And again, this is kind of like with Lincoln. This was kind of like with Lincoln, you know what I'm saying? Because when you look back and you realize you had John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. During the time with John F. Kennedy's assassination from 1964 forward, we had many civil rights people assassinated. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X as well. Malcolm X was waking up. They killed him because he was waking up to the truth about the Islamic states and the Muslims, and realizing, whoa, did he make a big mistake? But before he got a chance to expose, which he did expose a lot of the truth he was coming about to understand when you watch the truth of the archives with the man. And if you know anybody that knows him, or when I was a kid, I actually knew people who knew him and talked about what happened and gave me like firsthand knowledge from what they knew. So I mean, I consider a blessing. But also too, these things are self-evident in many of the videos that were made by him, that he was waking up to the truth of Islam, and that Islam really wasn't for the black Americans at all. But now we get an LBJ. LBJ, what happened with him was Martin Luther King had got arrested. I believe it was in Alabama, and he was in jail. And when John F. Kennedy was president, the Democrats thought, hey, if he made a move to do something to help Martin Luther King, it might attract them, some of the Republican black Americans to maybe consider voting Democrat. So Kennedy took advantage of that, and he went and made some phone calls, and he got Martin Luther King released from the Alabama jail. Then this leads up to where, Kennedy winds up getting killed, though, and then we wind up with LBJ. And then LBJ is, they try to push this guy off like he was, not a racist and what have you. But the truth of the matter of what we know today in relation to LBJ, like this here was a thing that's on the liberal site Snoops. It says here, did LBJ say, I'll have those N-words voting Democrat for 200 years? Well, they don't admit it and they don't deny it. They just say it's unproven. But underneath it, they list the truth about him and many different things about what he did. To give you an idea, like here, it says, LBJ, these are quotes of Lyndon B. Johnson, what he said. He said, these Negroes are getting pretty uppity these days. This is something Obama did in one of his speeches as well. He references back to this. They get pretty uppity these days. That's a problem for us since they've got something now they've never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference. For if we don't move at all, then their allies will line up against us and there'll be no way of stopping them. We'll lose the filibuster and there'll be no way of putting a break on all sorts of wild legislation. It'll be Reconstruction all over again. Now, the thing I would like to ask every black American to consider in his statement when he made, who do you think he's talking about in reference to the black man's allies? Because it's not the Democrats. He's talking about the Republicans. That's what he's fearing. That's the only reason that LBJ went along with the civil rights, because he knew it had Republican support. He knew that Kennedy had pushed it to a point, and they were going to use it. They had a plan, and they succeeded on it, because look at your life. Look what you got when you switched over to the Democratic Party. You got free handouts to wind up in ghettos. Ghettos that are just, where you get the bare minimum to even survive in life. That's what you get for free. You get enough to just get from life the bare minimum life will afford you for free under Democratic authority. And this is a fact. When you look, I just want to touch base on some of the things here. Here you got, just so you know, LBJ was very good friends with Robert Byrd, who was a long-standing senator. Robert Byrd was a man who was, I don't know if you're familiar with who Robert Byrd was, but I'm sure you are if you're a Democrat, because Robert Byrd was a former, what they call, Grand Wizard in the Ku Klux Klan for a long, long time. And it's funny because, you don't get to that level in what would be considered a short period of time. You have to be very in-depth and dedicated and involved in the Ku Klux Klan to become like a Grand Wizard and a big Ku Klux Klan recruiter, and that's what this man was. This was Robert Byrd. Now, the Democratic Party, if you say there's this big switch, which is so crap, it's just unbelievable that the Democrats try to say they became the Republicans and the Republicans the Democrats. This is such a crock. But I just want you all to take a remembering listen to what Hillary Clinton had to say about Robert Byrd.
Today, our country has lost a true American original, my friend and mentor, Robert C. Byrd. Senator Byrd was a man of surpassing eloquence and nobility. And I will remember him for many things, but most of all, for a heartfelt comment he made to me in the dark days following the attack on our country on 9/11. My state of...
Okay, as you can see in that was just for the point of just showing her mentor and hero. Okay, Robert Byrd, former Ku Klux Klan wizard, major recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan, suppressor of black people for decades in this country. Okay, perpetrates that he left the Klan and now he's all for, freedom and liberty for the black man. Well, this man was one of the biggest Ku Klux Klan members in the Virginia area. And along with him was your so-called hero, Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay, and Lyndon B. Johnson really liked Robert Byrd, and I have a thing here that's a little quippet I like to play. This is a conversation between Lyndon B. Johnson and Robert Byrd, and I just want to play a short part of it so you can understand just how much Robert Byrd was liked by Lyndon B. Johnson.
All I know is I love you, and you're just cooking up so damn much business. I didn't know you were that young and active. I thought you got your
So as you can hear in that, I mean, and he expresses it several times. I'll post a link to this. You can listen. Several times he tells Robert Byrd, he praises Robert Byrd, how he loves him. You know, he can't believe the work he's doing and what have you. Now, mind you, like I said, Robert Byrd was a grand wizard in the Ku Klux Klan in Virginia. Come to find out later on, now we know from recently released records that as well, which I'll leave a link to this as well, we find out that Lyndon B. Johnson himself was a Ku Klux Klan member. This letter here was something that was released during a time about related to a file with John F. Kennedy when he was assassinated. I'll post a link to this and you can see it at the bottom. It says here, Ned Cudstone, editor of the Counselor, has been identified by a confidential informant, it gives a number, as a member of the original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The source advised in December 1963 that Touchstone claimed that the Klan had documented proof that President Johnson was formerly a member of the Klan in Texas during the early days of his political career. So, as well, Lyndon B. Johnson, there's FBI evidence of fact of which now we know because these files are open, it's a fact. Lyndon B. Johnson was as well a Klan member. When you take all these things into consideration for the truth of the fact, you know, it gets to be really hard to understand for me why any black American would want to be a Democrat. I just don't understand because, you know, you got offered welfare. Look at the ghetto areas. Just and real quick, because we're getting near time, I'm going to end this. But here's something I want all black Americans to consider. You're a minority, right? And you are in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party pursues that of a democracy in government. America is a republic, not a democracy. You can look up Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. Every state in the Union is guaranteed a Republican form of government, and every black American should want that. Okay, and I'm going to explain to you why. You're in the Democratic Party, and what you need to understand is the Democratic Party is a majority rule party. You're a minority. Even among the Democratic Party, you only make up about 27% of the population of the Democratic Party. You're a very small minority. And in a Democratic Party, the majority rules. Now, for decades now, they've been telling you and promising you and giving you the bare minimum to scrape by, putting you in cities that have turned into slums and ghettos. Your children are subject to go to schools that are like prisons. I mean, it's disgusting what they're doing. And everybody wants to blame the Republicans. Well, how can you blame the Republicans? We're not the ones governing these ghettos. You keep electing these Democrats on the promises they keep offering you, which you never get. And I'll tell you why you never get them. You're a minority. You are depending on a democratic democracy of a government party that only rules by a majority. And when they'll say, you know, you go and you cry what you want, you cry all you want, and they'll say, oh yeah, they appease you, they tell you, we're going to do that, we're going to fight for you, they're going to do that. You know, and then we're going to take it to the floor. But they know when it gets to the floor, the majority rules. And the minority, you fall on deaf ears because you're a minority. You're involved in the Democratic Party, which only favors that of a majority, and you are the minority. What don't you understand about why, for the past 50 years, you have been in nothing but a deteriorating situation where you're being promised over and over something that you never get? And the reason why you never get it, it's not the white man's fault, it's your own fault, because you're in the very party that has been suppressing you since the days of the Loyalists, with the very people who brought you here, fought a civil war to try and keep you slaves, afterward formed the Ku Klux Klan, enacted the Jim Crow laws, continuously opposed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, opposed anything, even the 1965 amendments to give any rights to you, and then turned around and suckered you in as a minority to a party that favors the majority. And you fell for it. You fell for it. And you took it in exchange for free handouts that they promised you. And right now, like with this retribution thing, it's another free handout they're promising you, trying to hold on to you in their party. Because in America, we're a republic. And under the Republican system, you understand it's not about the majority. Every individual has equal rights under a Republican form of government. So if you and me are like you or me, white or black, doesn't matter. If we both own a house and the whole entire population of the nation decides by a majority rule they want to take our house, but the Constitution guarantees us a right to be secure in our persons and property. And under that right, the whole nation by a majority cannot take our house, cannot take our rights. Must instill to us equal justice and equal rights as everybody in the country. The Republican Party is for the individual, the minority, not the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is for the majority. You're a minority in the Democratic Party and a minority in the state, the United States. I mean, the black population in America, I believe, only takes up 1/3 of the nation's population. In the Democratic Party, you only make up, I believe, like 27%. So you're a minority on top of a minority in a majority party of the Democrats who favor a democracy of majority rule. This is why you're not getting nothing. This is why you are in the situation you're in, because you don't matter to a majority rule party. And if you don't have independent, self-secured rights as you would have with the Republican Party, you're subject to what that majority wants to do with you. And from the history, if you can't see it, you're freaking blind what these people want to do to you. Their allies today are the Islamic states, as you can see. Their allies are mostly with the world's right now, because everybody but America, there's no other country in the world like America. We're the only ones. Every other country is a democracy of some form of totalitarian regime, and that's who's allied with the American Democratic Party. You see the Muslims allied with them in the Islamic states. You see Britain allied with them because Britain's a democracy under monarchy rule. These people are their allies. And these people, mind you, the Islamic states, in this very day, under Sharia law, slavery is legal. In this very day, under Sharia law and under the Quran, right now, every non-Muslim is at threat of being enslaved by them. They still in this day go in and do slave raids in South Africa, East Africa. They bring them in, they sell them in Arabia, Libya, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. They have slave markets, and they're not just blacks neither. They're capturing white Christians and they're selling them. Okay, like I said, this is not really a white and black issue. It's a matter of ignorance. Because if you're not aware of it, what do you think the end result's going to be if the Democratic Party and the Islamic States get what they want? I'll tell you what it's going to be. Because when you look at the Islamic States, they're still back 1,400 years ago. Democrats are still fighting that civil war. They still want their democracy. Okay, and they still want their slaves, just like the Islamic States. What do you think the outcome's going to be when you got the Islamic States that's really, in truth, a very white supremacist organization? What do you think's going to be the outcome for you, really? I love this country. I don't care about people's color. If you love America, you love the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, you love the right of freedom, liberty, and justice for all, and equality for all. As an American, I don't give a damn what color you are, and neither should you. But you got to use common sense. And as far as this guy goes, like I say, if you want reparations, take your reparations to the people who are truly responsible. Bring your reparations to the Democratic Party, but there's no hope there because the Democratic Confederate slave states have been dissolved. So your next option, Britain's still there and the Islamic State's still there. These are the people who were selling you as slaves, capturing you as slaves, and exporting you for over 1,200 years before America was even founded, all around the world in slavery. So take your request for reparations to those really responsible, because the Republicans of these United States and the United States of America is not the ones responsible for black slavery. So get real, get over it, wake up, and because in America right now, many black and white Americans are waking up, and we're unified as what we are. One people. We're the Americans. One people. United as Americans, and we're going to stay that way as this republic. Okay? And we're going to keep this republic growing, and you're either with us or you're not. But like I say, if you want to understand why it has to be a republic, because that's the way we made it in the Constitution. Look up Article 4, Section 4. Every state in this union is guaranteed a Republican form of government so that every American in this nation is guaranteed their equal rights. Under a democracy, those rights can be taken away by a majority rule. Under a republic, those rights are secure. And that's the way we want to keep them. We're a constitutional republic with a constitution and a Bill of Rights that protects our rights and guarantees us equal equality. The reason you're not getting the benefit of it is because you're a minority in a majority party that wants a democracy of majority rule, and you think you're, as a minority, going to get heard in a party that only listens to a majority. That's your own fault. And this is something you need to wake up to. So like I said, I hope everybody, take the time. I'll put links with this video. Enjoy it and do your research. And if you want to comment on it. And I'll look for the comments and I'll see what I can reply. So thank you to everybody, and I'll see you next time.